The helicopter's rotating blades sliced through the crisp morning atmosphere like a mechanical saw above the tranquil water surface, as a vivid orange Coast Guard aircraft suspended itself above my personal waterfront pier, prepared for landing, when abruptly and unexpectedly it swerved sharply to the left, ascending back toward the heavens as though something had frightened it away. Bewildered, I emerged onto my veranda carrying my morning beverage only to discover a recently hammered lumber plank positioned where the official emergency identification marker had previously been located. In large crimson lettering, it proclaimed private property, no entry, or jurisdiction. My mouth fell open in disbelief. I hadn't installed it there and certainly hadn't given permission for anyone to interfere with my pier, which had maintained clearance as an emergency Coast Guard touchdown area for more than 10 years. That's when I spotted her positioned at the water's edge, gesturing triumphantly with a mallet in one grip and a mug of herbal beverage in the other. Karen from the Homeowners Association. Naturally it was her. She silently articulated, "You're welcome," as if she had just resolved global conflict. She had zero comprehension that she had just perpetrated a federal crime. The morning had begun like every other serene lakefront dawn. Avian creatures sang, the atmosphere was mirror-like in its stillness, and the breeze carried that morning moisture fragrance that transformed the deck into a refuge. I had prepared a fresh coffee pot and intended to complete some remote tasks before launching my vessel. My pier wasn't merely a pleasant amenity. It served an essential function not only for myself but for the Coast Guard as well. Following a regional flooding disaster years earlier, FEM and DHS collaborated with several private landowners like myself to establish strategic locations for aquatic rescue operations and helicopter touchdowns. My pier was among those chosen. I had cooperated with federal engineers to strengthen it, incorporate the precise steel specifications they demanded, and guarantee it was GPS recorded and encoded for quick identification. That pier wasn't simply timber and hardware, it represented a vital safety location. Witnessing that absurd placard hammered into one of the supports made my temper flare. I descended the walkway, boots grinding on stone, partially hoping I was mistaken. Perhaps some children had executed a prank. However, no, as I approached closer, I observed the laminated HOA emblem stapled to the bottom with Karen's name beside it in permanent marker. Below it stated, "Unapproved dock operations subject to penalties." My mind couldn't determine whether to yell or chuckle. Then I detected her shrill voice behind me declare, "I accomplished what was necessary. You can't simply permit anyone to utilize community property." I rotated slowly and she stood there in complete exercise attire, sun protection positioned like a tire of arrogance and a small writing pad in her grasp. Karen had recently won election as HOA chairwoman, primarily because she out-argued everyone else and vowed to cultivate additional lavender plants. Since that time, she'd appointed herself the personal mission to examine every square foot of the community for what she termed non-compliant constructions. She'd already prohibited porch swings exceeding 5 feet, declared someone's antique bicycle storage a danger, and now apparently decided my pier required her imperial attention. I explained to her as peacefully as possible, "Karen, this pier is not HOA territory. It's private and more significantly, it's federally recorded. It's a Coast Guard entry point. You just disrupted a federal system." She dismissed this and responded, "Oh please, you expect me to accept that little fishing platform is a government installation? Is James Bond planning to drop by as well? It would have been amusing if it wasn't so hazardous." I clarified again, displaying the laminated identifier from DHS and Coast Guard that was previously attached near the end, now torn away. I even retrieved a printed version of the understanding agreement I maintained with the emergency response team. She rolled her eyes and commented, "Appears like Photoshop. Maybe next time employ superior typography." I realized then that reasoning wouldn't succeed. Karen wasn't concerned with facts. She was concerned with authority. So I chose to contact someone who could silence her for me. I retreated into the residence and placed the call to Commander Nolan at the Regional Coast Guard Station. He didn't pause. He said they'd be dispatching a team that afternoon to evaluate the interference and respond properly. When I informed him about the unauthorized signage and the canceled landing that morning, his tone became frigidly serious. By mid-afternoon, 2 Coast Guard personnel in uniform appeared at my location with writing pads, communication devices, and facial expressions that indicated they weren't in the mood for HOA theatrics. I welcomed them at the entrance and escorted them down to the pier where Karen was still relaxing in a folding chair, sun hat angled back as if she possessed the place. When she noticed the officers, her demeanor shifted from arrogant to surprised, but she regained composure quickly, stating, "Good afternoon. I assume you're here to assist our initiatives to preserve community security." The larger officer didn't even blink. "Mom, did you install this sign?" She responded. "Certainly, I'm the HOA chairwoman. This location isn't appropriate for unmonitored public access." He looked at her and stated, "This dock is a federally designated emergency entry location. Your sign caused a helicopter to cancel landing during a planned exercise. That's a serious infraction." Karen attempted to dismiss it, saying, "Well, I wasn't informed about that. Shouldn't there be documentation or permits or something?" I provided the officer the exact paperwork she had disregarded earlier. He examined it, acknowledged, and photographed the sign. Then he radioed back with a brief status report. Within 10 minutes, a small patrol vessel docked and another officer accompanied them. Karen was now walking nervously in place, asking if she was facing arrest, which no one had mentioned, but she seemed to anticipate it. They didn't detain her. Not yet, but they did present a written caution and directed her to eliminate all unauthorized signage immediately. She declined. She actually stated, "I'll have my lawyer relative examine this. He understands municipal regulations. The officer didn't debate. They simply notified her that any additional interference would initiate obstruction accusations under federal statute and possibly Homeland Security Authority depending on incident seriousness. Karen's complexion went ashen, and for the first time, she didn't have a response. They eliminated the sign themselves, recording the removal and reattaching the Coast Guard identifier where it belonged. They even installed a QR sticker that connected directly to the Federal Registry of Emergency Landing Sites. Karen stood there seething but quiet. After the officers departed, she marched up to me and declared, "You believe this is finished? I manage this community and you'll regret undermining me." I didn't respond. I just walked up the pier checking that the emergency markings were all secured. But in the back of my mind, I had a feeling this wasn't concluded. Karen wasn't the type to absorb lessons. She was the type to intensify. And I wasn't just going to require backup. I was going to need evidence, cameras, community witnesses, and perhaps even legal support. Because when HOA Karens declare warfare, they don't just trespass, they rewrite the regulations and nail them to your property like feudal dictators. What she didn't realize was that the Coast Guard wasn't just mildly irritated, they were escalating this to internal legal teams. And I was just beginning too. This was no longer about a pier. It was about the boundary between authority and responsibility. And Karen was about to discover exactly what occurs when you attempt to obstruct a federal lifeline with a 10 wooden placard and a yoga mat. The quiet that followed Karen's unsuccessful confrontation with the Coast Guard didn't persist long. The very following morning, a typed correspondence was inserted under my entrance. A special HOA notification with her signature at the bottom, still written in that flowing script like it was a wedding announcement. It proclaimed that an emergency board session had been scheduled to vote on the unauthorized occupation and modification of shared community infrastructure. She had the audacity to reference my pier, my private, legally documented, federally registered pier, as if it were part of the HOA's pool area. And the finest part, the meeting was being conducted in the community center at 10:00 a.m. that same day, a time she likely presumed I wouldn't be available since she always scheduled meetings while I was either working or out participating in Coast Guard exercises. But today I was prepared. When I entered the community center, the atmosphere changed. Half the board members avoided visual contact. A few residents appeared puzzled, clearly not included in the scheme. Karen was already positioned at the front of the room beside a dry erase board labeled Community Doc Concerns, with a bunch of fabricated bullet points underneath it. She beamed when she saw me and said in the most patronizing voice possible, "Oh, there he is. Glad you could attend. We were just discussing public safety issues regarding unregulated structures." I calmly seated myself in the rear and let her continue. She rambled about pier deterioration, unauthorized electrical installation, which didn't even exist, and the hazard of people slipping on wet surfaces. Then she revealed her major surprise. She held up a fraudulent survey she claimed was conducted in the community showing residents favored the pier be reclaimed by the HOA and demolished due to safety issues. Naturally, none of the signatures were dated and most were from her book club companions. Then came the vote. Karen raised her hand and gestured to her circle of supporters who followed accordingly like mechanical toys. 5 hands rose. One man, Greg, hesitated. He was the only one not mesmerized by Karen's daily pastries and backyard hot yoga. Then just before she could announce victory, I stood up. I thanked the board for hearing my perspective, though they hadn't, and explained that the pier was not only on private land, but that it was a designated federal resource maintained at my own cost under direct authorization of the United States Coast Guard. I retrieved a folder and laid down every document, copies of the memorandum, photographs of the pier's reinforcement work done under Coast Guard guidance, the official registry identification numbers, and a signed letter from Commander Nolan himself confirming its status. The room became silent. Karen crossed her arms and muttered, "Anyone can print things on fancy paper. That doesn't make it law." That's when I revealed the final card. I distributed certified letters from the Regional Coast Guard Legal Office stating that any interference with the pier would be treated as obstruction under Maritime Security Code. That included unauthorized signage, attempts at demolition, or any interference with landing procedures. Karen grabbed one of the letters and scanned it, her lips twitching as she tried to find something to dispute, but there was nothing. It was sealed, notarized, and crystal clear. If she or the HOA touched that pier again, they would not be dealing with me, they'd be dealing with federal prosecutors. Greg, the board member who had hesitated earlier, cleared his throat. He was a retired logistics officer and had always maintained a low profile. He said, "I've seen a lot of documents in my time. This is the real deal. We'd be foolish to challenge it." Karen's jaw tightened. She realized she was losing control, but instead of backing off, she did what only a true HOA tyrant would do. She escalated. That night, while checking my security camera feed from the house, I caught movement at the edge of the pier. 2 teenagers, one of them Karen's nephew, were trying to spray paint over the Coast Guard's official marker on the pier's woodwork. The other was tampering with the bolts like he was trying to loosen them. I called out through the deck speaker and activated the motion sensor floodlight. They scrambled, but not before the cameras got a crystal clear view of their faces. I recorded everything, logged the incident, and called it in to Commander Nolan as instructed. He asked for the footage and told me bluntly, "That's now considered a federal obstruction attempt. We'll be escalating this." The next day, Karen came storming down the path toward my porch, red-faced and snarling. She waved her phone in the air and shouted that I had illegally filmed minors and threatened to sue for harassment. I calmly informed her that my cameras were legally installed on private property and recorded everything that happened on my own land. And those kids, They were caught tampering with a federal resource. That's not a prank. That's a crime. She huffed and stormed away, but I could tell from the way her hand shook that she finally realized she might have pushed too far. Later that evening, a Coast Guard legal liaison personally delivered a cease and desist notice to Karen's address. He handed it to her in front of her neighbors, who watched the exchange with quiet curiosity. The notice wasn't just for her, it extended to the entire HOA board and prohibited any member from interfering with the pier or its surrounding area. Violation could lead to fines, criminal charges, and potential civil action. I didn't ask for them to go that far, but Karen had made it impossible to de-escalate. Meanwhile, word started spreading around the neighborhood. People who had kept quiet before began to talk. Apparently, Karen had also tried to find someone for hanging a small American flag, declared a child's lemonade stand a commercial venture, and even threatened a veteran with eviction over his PTSD service dog. The tide was turning. Her once loyal army of followers began to shrink. The same people who had voted with her during the emergency meeting were now avoiding her gaze. One of them even approached me privately and apologized, saying they thought she was just bluffing with the pier thing. But Karen wasn't done. She called another emergency meeting, this time with a new strategy. She claimed that since the pier couldn't be used for community purposes, it should be declared an eyesore and reported to code enforcement for removal. She even printed mock photos of the pier taken at unflattering angles, trying to make it look unstable and rotting. It was absurd. I had just repainted it last month, and the Coast Guard had approved its structure for landings. This time, though, I didn't go alone. I brought with me 2 Coast Guard officers in uniform. They stood silently at the back of the room as I calmly debunked every lie Karen tried to spin. When she claimed the pier was dangerous, one of the officers stood up and said, "That pier is rated for vertical lift capacity, storm resistance and vessel mooring. It meets federal standards." End of discussion. Karen's voice trembled as she tried to speak, but no one listened. Her voice, once loud and bossy, now sounded like background noise. It was clear the power she wielded through intimidation and deception was beginning to crumble. But even then, I knew she wouldn't go down quietly. Karen was the type who would take the whole ship down just to prove she was the captain. I left the meeting that night with mixed feelings. On one hand, I had allies now. On the other, I had a growing suspicion that she was about to make her boldest and dumbest move yet. And if I was right, the next chapter in this absurd saga wasn't going to be a vote or a flyer or a citation. It was going to be an all-out disaster. Because when you back Karen into a corner, she doesn't retreat, she explodes. And my pier was still her favorite target. 3 days passed in tense silence. The kind that didn't mean peace, just that the storm hadn't hit yet. I kept checking my cameras like clockwork, waiting for the next stunt. Karen hadn't been spotted near the pier, but her porch light stayed on all night, and she'd installed a new motion-activated sprinkler system aimed suspiciously toward my lawn. I thought maybe the cease and desist letter from the Coast Guard had finally scared her into submission, but deep down I knew better. Karen wasn't the type to retreat. She was the type to buy time, reload, and come back swinging. I just didn't know how far she'd go until that Saturday morning when everything blew wide open. It started with smoke. Not metaphorical tension or echo drama, but real, thick plumes of smoke rising from the far side of the lake. I noticed it first through my kitchen window while pouring coffee. Within seconds, my phone buzzed with alerts from the community group chat. A tourist boat carrying a family of 6 had caught fire mid-lake. Someone's barbecue setup had tipped over, igniting a small gas canister. People were screaming. The boat was drifting toward the shallow cove, and the flames were climbing. This wasn't some minor HOA inconvenience. It was a full-blown emergency. And everyone in the neighborhood knew what that meant. The fastest and only safe landing point for emergency personnel was my pier. I rushed outside and unlocked the gate, pulling off the cable barrier I'd installed to keep out trespassers after Karen's nephew tried another stunt. I grabbed the emergency beacon from my shed, a bright orange panel with a built-in GPS marker, and placed it at the end of the pier. Within minutes, I could hear the hum of approaching rotors. The Coast Guard helicopter was already en route. But just as I turned to check the path behind me, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Karen and a crew of her sycophants had set up what looked like a lakeside block party right at the base of the pier. Tents, music, tables with fruit trays, and paper banners reading, "OA Family Safety Day," were spread across the access path like a cheerful little barricade. She saw me and smiled, waving like it was just a lovely coincidence. I yelled across the lawn, telling her to clear the area immediately, but she cupped her hands and shouted back, "It's a community celebration. We're just trying to bring people together. You can land your little boat elsewhere. It's not a runway." It wasn't just a party. She had intentionally blocked the only federally approved landing zone during an active emergency. I didn't wait. I radioed in the obstruction over the Coast Guard's civilian access channel, alerting them that the pier path was compromised. They confirmed visual contact and diverted slightly to circle while coordinating with ground units. Seconds later, a patrol boat cut across the lake from the opposite side, headed straight for my property. On board were 2 uniformed officers and a fire rescue team. They didn't knock or ask politely. They stormed through the crowd of stunned partygoers and began tearing down the barricades without hesitation. Karen shrieked as one officer clipped her string of balloons with rescue shears and shouted, "You can't just destroy my decorations. This is private property." The officer turned to her, ice in his voice, and said, "Ma'am, you are actively interfering with an emergency response operation. Stand back or you will be detained." It was the first time I saw her speechless. She actually backed up. Within moments, the pier was cleared and rescue efforts began. The helicopter descended low enough to deploy equipment, and the patrol boat helped tow the burned vessel to shore. The family was shaken but alive, suffering minor burns and smoke inhalation. The father, who had been trying to douse flames with bottled water, hugged the responders as if they were gods. I stood at the end of the pier, taking in the scene, but I knew my part wasn't done. Cameras mounted along the fence had caught every detail of Karen's obstruction. The tents, the banners, the screaming, and most damning of all, her telling the officer to go land somewhere else. Later that evening, as the sun set over a now quiet lake, a black SUV pulled into Karen's driveway. A man in a government-issued windbreaker stepped out, flanked by a uniformed officer. They rang her doorbell and waited. Neighbors peeked out from blinds and porch chairs like it was a live-action soap opera. She opened the door, and her expression dropped the second she saw the seal on the folder in the man's hand. She tried to play polite hostess, even offered iced tea, but they didn't come for refreshments. They served her a legal notice citing her for obstruction of a federal emergency operation. Not a warning this time, but a full citation with a pending court summons. Word spread fast. The community chat exploded. Screenshots of Karen arguing with the rescue team went viral. Someone edited a meme of her standing with a sign saying, "No helicopters allowed," and superimposed it on a flaming background. Even people who had been neutral in the past started to post things like, "She's gone too far," and "How can we trust the OA after this?" But Karen wasn't done yet. That same night, she posted a long Facebook rant filled with half-baked legal theories and passive-aggressive jabs about certain individuals abusing fake federal connections. She claimed the Coast Guard had overstepped their bounds and that she would be pursuing damages for emotional distress. Comments flooded the post, most of them mocking her or correcting her inaccuracies. One even pointed out that interfering with federal responders during an active rescue could land someone in jail for years. She eventually deleted the post, but the screenshots lived on. The following morning, I received a call from Commander Nolan himself. He thanked me for my vigilance and cooperation and informed me that the legal office had begun an internal review. Karen's name had been flagged and forwarded to the Department of Homeland Security for inclusion on their local civilian interference watch list. She wouldn't be arrested yet, but the consequences were stacking up. More importantly, the Coast Guard was returning that week to repaint the pier with more obvious federal markings, install new signage, and mount a real-time response beacon with satellite connectivity. No more room for denial. Back at the clubhouse, the atmosphere had shifted. Karen called for an emergency damage control meeting, but only a handful showed up. Most board members claimed they were sick or had family over. Greg, the only sane one left on the board, walked out halfway through her speech about biased federal enforcement. One by one, people were peeling away from her side. She blamed me in whispers, accused me of manipulating the system, and warned others that I was dangerous. But the neighborhood wasn't listening anymore. Instead, people started approaching me directly. Some offered to help repaint the pier. Others brought coffee and thanked me for protecting the community. One elderly woman who had lived there for over 40 years quietly said, "You're the first person who's ever stood up to her and made it stick. Thank you." I didn't feel like a hero. I just felt tired, but I also knew something deeper had shifted. Karen had crossed a line that couldn't be walked back. The illusion of her power had cracked, and behind that illusion, there was nothing but ego and bluster. The pier had survived. The family had been rescued. But this wasn't over. Karen didn't know how to quit. She only knew how to escalate. And if her next move was anything like I feared, it wasn't going to involve flyers or Facebook. It was going to involve courts, codes, and chaos. But now I had something she'd never understand: public support, federal backup, and a camera recording 24 hours a day. Let her try. The neighborhood felt different in the days that followed, not just quieter, but heavier, like everyone was holding their breath. The rescue had shaken things. Seeing helicopters descend and emergency crews storm the pier had reminded people this place wasn't just some managed oasis of manicured lawns and lemonade stands. It was a real community, connected to the larger world by the same systems that protected lives. And Karen, through either arrogance or willful ignorance, had nearly gotten people killed trying to prove she could control something that was never hers. But she wasn't done, not even close. The Karen storm wasn't over. It was regrouping, recalculating, and about to slam back with full delusion. It began with a notice tacked to the clubhouse bulletin board in hand, delivered to mailboxes in cheap plastic sleeves. Members were invited to a community accountability summit, hosted by none other than Karen. The flyer's language was carefully worded to avoid anything that could be legally challenged, but the intent was clear. She was rebranding herself as a safety advocate who had been misunderstood, and was trying to frame the Coast Guard citation against her as a political witch hunt. She invited legal analysts, or so she claimed, and offered coffee and snacks as bait. Most people rolled their eyes, but curiosity won out, and nearly half the neighborhood showed up, if only to see what nonsense she'd try next. When I arrived, I stayed near the back, leaning against the wall with my arms crossed. Karen stood at the front in a crisp blouse, like she was preparing to run for Congress. She started with a long speech about reclaiming community dialogue and protecting property from external overreach. She never mentioned the boat fire or passive phrases like events. Then she unveiled her grand solutions: a motion to begin reevaluating legacy sewer structures within the HOA boundary for compliancy assessment, which was her new way of saying she wanted to get rid of the closing entitlement control. And right in the middle of her slideshow was a picture of my pier, blurred slightly but unmistakable. Before anyone could speak, she invited her so-called legal advisor to the front. A middle-aged man in an ill-fitting suit stepped up and began rambling about municipal authority and show autonomy. He tossed around terms like non-conforming assets and easement variants like confetti. But the more he spoke, the more obvious it became that he wasn't a lawyer. At least not the kind she needed. He stuttered when questioned, misquoted local statutes, and couldn't even explain the difference between public utility land and private infrastructure. Finally, someone asked directly, "Are you licensed in this state?" He dodged. Then someone else asked, "What's your field?" He admitted in a half-mutter that he was a bankruptcy paralegal from another county. The room shifted. You could feel the mood turning like a tide pulling back from the shore. Greg, the retired officer and board member, stood and said clearly, "I've seen more organized scams in basic training. You're selling nonsense, and you're dragging the whole neighborhood down with you." Karen's cheeks flushed. She tried to regain control by raising her voice and blaming misinformation, but it was too late. She had brought in a fraud to defend a lie, and now even her closest allies were looking at her sideways. I didn't speak. I didn't have to. The truth had its own momentum now. The very next day, Greg and 2 other board members submitted a motion to remove Karen as HOA president. They had the signatures needed, and with community support building, a formal vote was scheduled. Karen, realizing she was cornered, tried to spin it into a smear campaign. She started posting in the online neighborhood forum under fake names, praising herself and questioning the legitimacy of the board's actions. But the IP addresses betrayed her, and one of the moderators publicly outed her sock puppet account. It was like watching a dam crack in slow motion, years of built-up arrogance collapsing under the weight of her own ego. Meanwhile, the Coast Guard had returned to my pier as promised. They installed new federally issued signage with laminated warnings, satellite-sensed ID numbers, and even a small encrypted device that pulsed a blue light when rescue protocols were activated nearby. It looked more official than ever. Kids passing by would stop and ask questions. Some residents even brought snacks and thanked the officers for their help. One mother, whose kids had been playing near the lake the day of the fire, came to me with tears in her eyes. She said, "I didn't realize how important this pier was. I do now. Thank you for not backing down." But even with the tide turning, Karen made one last desperate push. On the morning of the vote, she filed a cease and desist order through a local attorney, not against the board but against me. She claimed I was creating a hostile environment and interfering with community management. She attached screenshots of her own failed Facebook post, blurry images from the emergency rescue as if they were evidence of abuse, and a copy of a letter she wrote to the Coast Guard demanding a full retraction of their citations. I laughed when I read it. It was a tantrum printed in legal formatting. I didn't need to fight that alone. The Coast Guard's legal team stepped in and sent an official response within hours. Her claims were baseless, and she was warned once again that further harassment or defamation could lead to formal legal action. That shut it down for good. The vote happened that evening in the clubhouse. It was a packed house, folding chairs were dragged from garages, and people stood in the hallway just to witness what everyone quietly hoped would be the end. Karen, red-eyed and still trying to smile, gave one last speech about dedication and vision. She claimed she only ever wanted to protect the community. Greg calmly stood after her and read the facts: the unauthorized sign, the emergency obstruction, the false legal advice, the fabricated votes, the slander, the reckless misuse of power. Then came the vote. 34 residents raised their hands. One did not, hers. Karen was officially removed as HOA president. She stood there for a moment, as if she might contest the result, but nobody made eye contact. Nobody defended her. She picked up her clipboard, muttered something about ungrateful people, and left the room. Just like that, the rain was over. Outside, I stood on my lawn, watching the last bit of daylight reflect on the water. The pier looked peaceful again. Not just a piece of wood stretching over the lake, but a symbol of something bigger, a place of purpose. A place worth defending. Karen might have been removed from power, but part of me knew this wasn't her last act. People like her didn't disappear quietly. They festered, they schemed. But the difference now was that the neighborhood had woken up. The spell was broken. The whispering alliances were gone, and if she ever tried something again, she'd find herself facing not just me, but an entire community armed with truth, accountability, and a Coast Guard, approved landing zone that didn't flinch when things got serious. Let her plan, let her file papers, let her post passive-aggressive rants into the void. She'd already lost the only thing that ever gave her control, the illusion that no one would stand up to her, and I'd made sure that illusion was gone for good. A week after Karen's removal, the neighborhood started to breathe again. It was subtle at first. People walking their dogs actually smiled at each other. Kids rode bikes near the clubhouse without getting scolded. Someone even put up a cheerful little sign near the lake that said, "Community over control," and no one tore it down. The tension that had wrapped around every HOA meeting and bulletin board like barbed wire had finally begun to loosen. But while the residents moved on, Karen didn't. She retreated into her house like a wounded general after a failed coup. Blinds drawn, porch empty, car parked rigidly in the center of her driveway, as if defying the world to challenge her presence. But she wasn't idle. She was waiting, plotting, desperate for one last move to claw back her illusion of power. And true to form, she chose the most ridiculous hill to die on. It began with another letter. This time it wasn't from the HOA or the Coast Guard. It came from Karen herself, printed in thick, bold ink and wrapped in a plastic sleeve like it was sacred scripture. She claimed that since the HOA no longer recognized her authority, she was launching a new Neighborhood Preservation Committee, or NPC for short. She said the NPC was a voluntary civic group with moral oversight designed to monitor misuse of public spaces. and she declared that the first subject of their oversight would be my pier. She even included a fine schedule and a list of made-up infractions like unauthorized paint color and non-native birds nesting nearby. At first, I thought it was a joke. But the next morning, I saw her in a reflective vest with two of her yoga friends, pacing the edge of my lawn with clipboards. They had tape measures, little orange flags, and cameras. One of them crouched near a bush, measuring some imaginary boundary line like they were prepping for a televised renovation show. I walked out onto the porch sipping coffee and waited for Karen to speak first. She didn't disappoint. She smiled like nothing had happened and said, "Just taking note of potential shoreline violations. Nothing personal, of course. We're all about transparency now." I asked her if she was seriously launching a shadow HOA after being ousted, and she said with a straight face, "It's not a governance body. It's a concerned citizens coalition. Completely legal." I didn't argue. I just made a phone call, not to the Coast Guard this time, but to a local reporter I knew who'd been following the pier story ever since it went viral. I told him about Karen's new group, her fake citations, and how she was stalking the lakefront with a measuring tape. He laughed so hard I thought he dropped the phone. 2 days later, the story ran online with the headline, "HOA Queen launches fake agency after losing power, targets Coast Guard dock again." Within hours, the article was shared across every platform imaginable. The accompanying photo of Karen holding a flag next to the lake with a smug grin became the new neighborhood meme. Karen tried to spin it, of course. She posted a long Facebook rant claiming the media was twisting her words, that she'd been misrepresented, that she was only trying to restore order. But no one listened this time. People weren't just laughing, they were actively mocking her. Even her inner circle vanished. Her yoga friends quietly removed themselves from the NPC and started attending events hosted by the actual HOA. She was alone, and everyone knew it. To finally close the door on the chaos, the HOA organized a formal community event, Coast Guard Appreciation Day. It was a symbolic gesture, yes, but also a practical one. The pier had saved lives, it deserved recognition. The Coast Guard agreed to participate. On the morning of the event, a full patrol boat docked to my pier, and uniformed officers greeted residents, gave safety demos, and handed out small emergency kits to families. Children took pictures in the captain's chair. Parents asked questions about boating laws. There was louder food music. My pier, once the battleground of a ridiculous showy feud, was now the centerpiece of something good. Karen watched from her window, blinds tilted just enough to reveal her face. She didn't come out, she didn't speak, she just watched. I don't know what she thought as she saw a Coast Guard officer hand a life vest to a 6-year-old, or when she saw neighbors she once scolded laughing together over hot dogs and lemonade. Maybe she felt regret, maybe she just felt fury. Either way, she stayed silent. But one final twist was still waiting. 2 days after the event, I received an official letter from